So now that you have watched the videos, and hopefully you have, if you haven't, I strongly encourage you to do so. Not because it's necessary for this course, it's just because those are really educational videos. So now that you have watched the videos, let me ask you this question. Imagine that you are offered a job as an accountant by both Lincoln Electric and SAS. Which job would you take? Now, if you major not in accounting but in, for example, HR, then the job offer is to work as an HR specialist. If you major in marketing, that would be a job to be a marketing specialist for each company. And the compensation package is exactly like it was described in the videos. Lincoln Electric offers you a very, very good money. You eat what you kill, that's true, and if you don't work well, you will not earn anything at that company. But if you do your job well, with all the bonuses and lavish bonuses, you will get a lot of money, at least twice as much as the industry average. As Lincoln claims it, they have the highest industry average pay. And if you do well, you can actually get 3 or maybe even 4 times as much money as what other companies pay for the same job. And again, at the same time, you don't get any perks, so there will be no health insurance, there will be no sick days, there will be no other commonly offered perks. And again, if you don't do well, you will not earn anything. But if you do work well, you will get a lot of money. Now, SAS offers you the same job, but at the same time, your pay will be average, right? Decent, but nothing outstanding. But there will be all those lavish benefits and perks that have been described in the video. So you will have everything from country club to masseur to flex time and all those other things that many people cherish so dearly. Now the question is, which company would you like to work for, SAS or Lincoln Electric? If you are like my students who take the course in class, you probably chose SAS. At least that's what 99% of the students choose. The reason I run this activity is because I see an interesting experimental outcome here, an interesting controversy, I guess, or an interesting inconsistency. Just a few minutes ago, I asked you which system is better, capitalism or socialism. And most of you, and I'm sure most of you did choose so, most of you thought that pure capitalism is a better system. I'm not judging you, you're probably correct. In fact, I'm with you. But when I asked you which company you want to work for, Lincoln Electric, that has a very capitalist type of approach to managing people, or SAS, which has a very socialist approach to managing people, pretty much all of you chose SAS. The reason I'm doing this activity is to open up your mind and be a little bit more receptive of other opinions. Capitalism and socialism and communism, those are very ideologically charged terms. In any country, when you ask those questions, people will see the answer in black and white. Here in the United States, most people will feel that capitalism is good and communism or socialism is bad. Go to China and ask that same question, and people will probably have a reversed opinion. Now, the truth is that if you present those people with the same question, but don't use those ideologically charged terms, most people will actually change their opinion quite drastically. And so here in the United States, for example, most of you did change your opinion and chose what would many describe as a socialist approach of SAS. So again, I'm not necessarily saying that you're wrong or you're right. I'm just trying to point out to you that the world is not black and white, and that when you will be doing business, for example, in China, and you will see people who disagree with you on the best economic system, don't look at them as if they were lunatics, even though that's how they may look at you. Try to see why they believe that way, and maybe there is something to it. If that doesn't convince you, maybe my statistics convinces you. When you look at Earth, the planet, you'll probably see more people, more billions of people who actually prefer not the capitalist approach, but the socialist approach. Europeans are notoriously socialist. Obviously Chinese, North Koreans, Cubans, obviously people in former Soviet Union. Those people tend to prefer a more socialist, if not entirely communist approach. And there are more people there in those regions than there are people here. And who am I or who are you to tell them that they are wrong and you are right? And yes, I generally believe that you're right and they're wrong. But then at the same time, when I'm looking at numbers, who knows? Maybe there is something to what they're saying. So just keep your mind open. Now let's talk about about economic systems in terms of more kind of theoretical approach. So as you understand, there is a whole continuum here, and so even though we talked about three main types: pure free market, pure planned economy, and some form of a mix, a combination of the two, um, there are obviously many more little subtypes, and so the continuum is, well, continuous. So the country may be anywhere on that continuum. If I asked you where the United States falls on this continuum, what would be your answer? Would it be A, B, C, or D, or E? Most students in my class, when I ask it in classroom, choose A, and I'm guessing that's probably what you chose, and this is not correct. The truth is, yes, the truth is that the United States is also not a pure free market economy. There are many areas of life or of economy in the United States that are regulated by the government and often regulated quite heavily. There are many programs that are paid from the taxpayers' money, which would be in a sense a definition of socialism, so we kind of share. And I'll give you a few examples. For example, education, particularly when you go and talk about educations at the elementary, secondary school level. Those are not only free but also basically mandated by the state. The state sets all the rules and defines all the policies. And yes, there are private schools, and that would be an exception, but the industry overall is very much socialist. The same applies to many socialist programs, like for example Medicare, Medicaid, defense programs, arts programs, all that kind of stuff. And even though again those are only small parts of life, but as you can see, overall, the United States is not a pure free market economy. So there are some things that are regulated by the government, some things that are paid for by the government, obviously through the taxes that you pay. And so, but then again, if you look at a larger picture and if you look at the whole spectrum, the United States is as close to pure market economy as it gets, at least in terms of what we have to choose from today. At the same time, countries that we often describe as communist, like for example Cuba or North Korea, well, they're quite not the pure communism examples. Particularly Cuba, that in the last year has been rapidly moving towards capitalist approach, but also North Korea. I mean, not everything is planned and regulated by the government there. So there are some traces of small business. People do exchange goods and services without the government being involved. So yes, they are definitely much more communist than capitalist, but at the same time they're not pure examples of planned economy or free market economy. And then obviously most other countries are somewhere in between. Another thing that I would like to point out is Canada. So here in the United States as well as in Canada, by the virtue of being neighbors, people often describe themselves in reference to the other. And so Canada often looks socialist to Americans, and then America obviously often looks capitalist to Canada. But the truth is that the two countries are not really that different. I've lived in both of those countries for an extended period of time, and when you look at the kind of larger picture, both countries are to far right on the spectrum. They're much more free economy than just about anything else. Also interestingly, that in many areas of life, Canada is actually more free market than the United States. For example, there is one of these measures of kind of free marketness, right? And one of them is the number of hours needed to start a business. In some countries it may be years, and for example, country of my origin, the former Soviet Union and then Ukraine, well, in former Soviet Union you just couldn't start a business. I mean, that was not legal. In Ukraine today you can, but it will take you several months. In the United States, the estimated time to start a business is 48 hours, 2 days. In Canada, it's actually 1 day. It is also 1 day in Singapore and New Zealand. So even though the difference is so small, but again, if Canadians wanted to brag about something, well, that would be one of the areas where they can say that they're even more free market oriented than Americans are. And again, these differences are completely meaningless because they're so small, but again, they're just something to give an example. Now, here is a perk for you for watching this video lecture. One thing that I'm not including in the lectures or slides that I'm posting online are these questions. So as says, the syllabus says, each lecture I'm going to reveal 5 questions to you, and those are the questions that are very likely to appear on the exam. They're exactly the same as the exam questions in terms of the format, in terms of the difficulty, in terms of the style, but some of them will not appear on the exam and some will. I guarantee you that at least one of these questions will be on the exam. Um, but the other ones will probably be on the exam too, but in some form of in a different form. I'll definitely change the wording. I'll probably change some of the answer options, but there will be something of that kind on the exam. And so here is your first question. Take a look and see if you know the answer. Well, the correct answer is B. The truth is that most countries have a mixed economy system, and again, some are mixed more towards capitalism, some are mixed more towards socialism, but again, no country has a pure example of an economic system, so all of them have traces of the other end of the spectrum. Now, let's talk about centrally planned economy. What are the features of this system, and what it takes to make money in a system like that? So what would be the examples of centrally planned economy? Well, Soviet Union probably was the best example. Luckily, it doesn't exist anymore, and again, I acknowledge my negative bias towards the communism and Soviet Union system, but at the same time, again, talking about examples, that was a very good one. Then China, obviously, for some time was a fairly good example of a centrally planned economy. Cuba, and then again, talking about China today, it still has lots of aspects of economy that are planned. And those of you who frown upon that kind of approach, well, look at the economic growth. That country seems to be doing extremely well. The Soviet Union, again, the country that I may not like very much. I love Ukraine, but not the Soviet system. But I must admit that it actually did show remarkable growth following the Second World War, when the country was completely destroyed. The planned economy approach allowed to rebuild the country fairly quickly, and just in 15-20 years after the war, they were actually doing so well that America was biting the dust, in a sense. They were the first to send the satellite into the orbit, the man into space, and eventually they did lose. But again, it seems like the planned economy was doing some good for that country for some time. Again, the other question is, what was the real price paid by the people? The number of lives and the number of restrictions that they had to go through, the number of lives they had to lose, and the number of restrictions they had to endure. But again, from the purely economic point of view, it seems like that system had some positives there. All right. Now, main features of the planned economy are welfare of the group is paramount, so the redistribution of wealth, and then economic and social equality is the goal. So in many cases, the goal is to make everyone equal. And the joke may be that, well, making everyone equally poor, but then again, the ideologist of planned economy would say making everybody equally rich, or at least making sure that nobody is unusually poor. Now, let's talk about the opponent's arguments about planned economy. And you probably know those very, very well. I mean, much of your education has been geared towards explaining why planned economies, or what is called here communism or socialism, are bad. And so let's review the opponent's arguments, why people or some people believe that planned economies are bad. Well, obviously, there is really no incentive to work in that economy. So the wages would be more or less fixed, the prices would be more or less fixed, and there is really no incentive to work hard. My dad, for example, was an engineer in the former Soviet Union and worked there all his life, and just retired a few days ago, actually. So he was an engineer. The irony of that system was that even though it was kind of prestigious to be an engineer, but your pay was completely fixed. There were several levels of pay for different professions, but once you're in a certain niche, in a certain level, that's what you make. And the paradox is that if you work extremely hard, you don't make anything, or not more than what your pay grade says you should be making. At the same time, if you don't do anything, you still make the same amount of money, and so there is really no motivation to start to work harder. My dad was an engineer, and he had a number of inventions, and so in the former Soviet Union they had what they call the workbook. So it's something similar to like your transcript here. It basically says where you work, what jobs you took, and then one of the things that book says or has pages for is your inventions and other types of records. Well, my dad had so many inventions that they actually had to first add pages to his book and then eventually give him a new book because he just ran out of pages. But at the same time, he wasn't really paid for that. So like one of the columns in that book was how much he was paid for whatever he was doing. And so some of his bonuses for his inventions were like an equivalent of today's $2, like literally 20 cents sometimes. And you would think, well, why would you want to do it? Well, he obviously did it for fun, not for money, because there was no money in it. But then when you think about this at the country level, the question becomes, well, why would anyone want to work harder? So why? Another interesting thing was that even though the communist system was a purely planned economy, the paradox was that there were some jobs that were paid based on piece rate. So, for example, if you worked as a welder in a factory, or if you did something else where there wasn't a clear output per unit, in many cases your job, or I mean your pay, would be determined by the number of units you make. And those people often would make a lot of money. And so the problem was that in many cases a welder or some kind of machinist working for a factory would be making 2 or 3 or even 4 times as much as the manager of the company, the director of the company. And again, that was also fairly, I'd even say, stupid, because I mean not nobody, but many people wouldn't see any value in education, because in many cases working on some kind of machine you can make much more money than what a manager or an engineer would make. And so the question becomes, why would you want to go to school? So the funny thing is that the only really motivation in the Soviet Union to work harder was all those motivational posters. Like this particular one says 5-year plan in 4, meaning that the Communist Party would set plans for every 5 years, and then they would put those posters all around the place, like literally across the country, and trying to motivate the people to complete the 5-year plan in 4 years. And yes, there might be a little bonus if you complete your plan sooner, but again, it would be like 5% of the salary, so definitely not enough to motivate enough people. Another problem of the planned economy is that it's definitely contradicting the basic human nature. Humans, through the course of evolution, we have this notion ingrained in our brains or central nervous system to own. We want to have more. We want to have more of things. Another thing that we want to do is make decisions. We definitely would like to make decisions, and we don't like when somebody else makes decisions for us. If we are put in a situation where other people make decisions for us, like prison or concentration camp or something of that kind, or army maybe even, many people kind of stop thinking after a while, and so many people would, what many describe, would degrade, so they kind of lose that propensity to enjoy life. So we don't want to be in a situation when somebody else makes decisions for us. Well, the planned economy is built on just that idea. Somebody makes decisions for you. So the central 5-year plan from the Communist Party and the former Soviet Union would specify exactly how much you have to make of certain goods, how you make them, and so people become almost like machines that just, their only purpose is to, basically act in accordance with that plan. And again, many people probably like that system. I mean, that's easy life, but at the same time, to most, I mean, we are created to be free, and so we don't really thrive under that system. The same thing, if you want to make a purely planned economy, you pretty much have to expropriate, nationalize just about all means of production. And so, because we don't have any society on the planet that has a purely communist system at this stage, or at this time, and pretty much never had, every time you want to implement a planned economy, you end up inevitably with some people losing their wealth. Here we have a picture of the Red Army soldier guarding property of people who have been, whose property has been nationalized. And so the way the system was built was that, the Red Army came, and there were all kinds of people who owned little factories or maybe had some land and horses. And all that stuff was taken away from them. And so as you can imagine, even though the system may not be so bad, at least in theory, but in practice it doesn't just appear by itself. It has to be done pretty much forcefully with guns and cannons. When the Soviet Union was established or came to the Western Ukraine, that's where my family is from. My grandparents, for example, had a fairly large farm, and my grandfather was specializing in breeding horses. And then the Soviet Union in 1939, Western Ukraine was added to Eastern Ukraine, and so the communist system was established. And so they just basically forcefully took all his land, all his horses, and then as a separate act of cruelty, they actually made him work with his own horses on his own land for pay, and a small pay, I should say. Now the horses were underfed, undernourished, and they started dying, and so for the rest of his life, as long as I remember, my grandfather, for example, he would sometimes start crying, and that's because, you know, he remembers those horses that he saw die and the generations of his family spent breeding. And so obviously he would be a vivid opponent of the system, because I mean it took everything he had from him, and he was not alone. So even though again on paper the system may look like a nice system, in practice it just, you know, doesn't appear from nowhere and peacefully. Now another problem is that humans have a limited capacity to plan. If you had to devise a plan for the entire country for 5 years and decide what needs to be made and when and how, it would be pretty much an impossible task. And so what often happens is that people tasked with this task would try to simplify it. So obviously you cannot plan for a wide variety, even if you put 100 or even 1,000 people together and say plan what we need in the next 5 years. I mean, it's just too much a task. We just have limited brain processing capacity. And so the outcome, at least in the former Soviet Union, was that everything was in a limited variety. Like for example, underwear. There were literally like 3 different types of men's underwear: blue, white, and black. They were all the same price in the entire country. They were the only 3 types you could get, and whole generations of people grew up knowing only those 3 different types of men's underwear. Bad or good, I don't know. The quality was decent. The price was low. So economies of scale allowed to do it, you know, of good quality at low price, but at the same time it's kind of no fun, right? And then many things, again, plans would be, you know, in many areas they would overplan the capacity or overestimate the needed capacity, and in some areas of life they would underestimate the needed capacity. And what happens is that you would sometimes walk into a store and you would have like whole shelves of, you know, for example, waffles of one type and nothing else. So basically they thought that people would eat more waffles, and so they made too many of those. But then they didn't think that people would want something else, and they didn't make enough of other stuff. And so like the whole store, like Walmart-sized store, would be selling one type of waffle or maybe 2 other products. So obviously absurd from today's point of view, but that's pretty much what, you know, that was. And so here you have a picture of people standing in line, and the line is endless, and you would see that stuff all the time. You would literally sometimes go home from work or from studies and you see 1,000 people lining up and, you know, waiting for something. You get in line even before you know what's being sold, because you know everything is in short supply, or at least many things are in short supply. And so you better get in that line, because if you don't buy it now, you may not have it tomorrow. And so yes, you would sometimes wait for hours and hours waiting to get your product, but I mean that was the reality of life, unfortunately. So here is an exercise that I want to run with you, and so let's see if you will be able to solve this challenge. This is one of the examples that I use to illustrate that people have limited planning capacity. Here is a question, and let's see if you can solve this challenge. So I'm going to show you a video, and your job is to watch the video and do what the instructions say. And the instructions will be: count the number of balls the team in white passes. So you will see 2 groups of people passing balls, and so every time a ball changes hands, that's 1. And so let's see if you will be able to count how many passes the team in white does. Now the answer is, it is 14. Many of you probably got it right. But the question is, did you see the gorilla? And if your question is, what gorilla? Well, let me show you. So I'm going to rewind it back, and it's exactly the same video that you just watched. So you're counting the balls, and here comes the gorilla. Not only it comes, it actually tries to attract your attention, doing all this kind of stuff. Did you see that gorilla the first time? Historically about 2/3 of the people don't see the gorilla. somehow when we focus on the balls or things, we tend to dismiss everything else. But now the question is, if you didn't see the gorilla, how could you be able to plan what's needed in terms of products for the entire country for the next 5 years if that was the task that you wanted to do? Well, obviously you can't. We just don't have enough RAM in our head. The processor is not fast enough. But that's the problem. That's what the planned economy relies on, and unfortunately it doesn't work. Here's another question. Count every F in the following text. So you have a passage here, a sentence. Count how many F letters are in this sentence. Now, most people say that there are 4. The truth is that there are 6. For some reason, our brain cannot process F's in off. So when you look at this passage here, you probably saw this F, you saw this F, and whatever the other 2 or 3 are. But for some reason, we don't really see F's like in off here or off there. I admit I didn't do it well, and I saw only 4 when I did it the first time. But again, it's not to say that I'm not smart enough, or those of you who didn't see all 6 are not smart enough. This is just our limited cognitive ability. And so again, people are just not very good at processing information, especially when we're dealing with huge amounts of information needed, for example, to plan the entire economy for the next several years. So planned economy run by humans, not very impressive. Finally, one of the strongest arguments against planned economy is that yes, it could have been possible maybe centuries ago when the economies were fairly isolated from one another, and you could plan for a specific location because that specific location had little contact with other locations. Well, in today's world, the innovation is happening so fast and the economies are so intertwined that there is absolutely no way you can predict what's going to happen even in this country in 2 years, in 1 year. I mean, iPhone nobody knew about it, 4 years ago? Today everybody has one. Google Docs or Google Maps, I mean, those are completely new products. I mean, electrical vehicles, new products appear so quickly that it's just impossible to know what to plan for in the next 5 years. I mean, from today's point of view, let's say we decided to make 25 million or billion iPhones because that's what we think people will need 5 years from now. Well, the truth is that in 5 years, iPhones will probably be obsolete. By that time, probably there will be something much, much better, much, much more developed. But we cannot plan for that today because we don't know what that will be. So even though in theory the planned economy may sound like a good idea, in reality it's just impossible. I mean, in today's globalized world with rapid innovation, it's just impossible to do it. Now I'm going to stop here, and the next video will discuss the supporters' arguments for planned economy. So even though most of you think that planned economy is bad, there are many people who see many positives, and we'll review those positives. Again, it's not to say that it's better than anything else, but at least definitely you'll need to know what the positives of the planned economy is. So stop here and watch video 3 from a separate file.